Hi, everybody. Can everybody hear me? It's all good. All right. So, hi, good evening. I'm Sam Presti. As Patty said, we've been doing this together for about 10 years. When we started Chicago for Chicagoans, it was really just a dream of Patty's to offer more accessible walking tours catered towards Chicago residents instead of tourists so that people could learn about the places where they live. And when we wrote our Edgewater tour, we really had no idea what we were doing. And the way that we wrote that tour and did our research was we started by just walking around the neighborhood a lot. And every time we saw something that was really interesting to us or a unique building or anything that seemed, worth researching, we started by just writing down addresses and then going into the Tribune archives to see if something interesting had ever happened there. And 100% of the time, something did. Um, so, like, starting from being baby historians, starting on this venture to 10 years later, I'm very proud of her. I'm very proud of us. And thank you for being here with me tonight. Um, so, I do normally focus a little bit about me. I am a born and raised Chicagoan, I'm third generation. Um, and I do normally focus on folklore and supernatural, maybe. As a folklorist, there's a lot of tall tales. And I've given another lecture on maritime history. It was very generous of Patty to let me do this one because I have another lecture in the series that was Deep Dark Lake, Michigan. And if you want to hear more about myths and tall tales and pirates and ghost ships, that is all included in the other lecture that is available. So my challenge was to keep this 100% historically accurate, uh, with a few interesting shipwrecks thrown in. But this will be fully just history instead of my typical sort of supernatural bend. So I when I saw the theme tonight, Chicago misconceptions, I also thought this was a good opportunity to do a sort of general survey of Chicago maritime history because it is a special interest of mine. And even people who are second, third, fourth generations forget, I think, right now that Chicago has such a rich maritime history that when I was trying to put this together as a very broad survey, it was hard not to do the entire history of the city because Chicago is so tied into its maritime history, even though we are slightly disconnected from it today. So the first misconception being that Chicago is landlocked. We are a coastal city on the third coast of the Great Lakes system. And the second, maybe even bigger misconception is that the Great Lakes are lakes, because they're not. When European settlers happened upon the Great Lakes region and really started to survey them and plot them out, they didn't know how to even comprehend of a system like this because there isn't anything like it anywhere else in the world. They really are big enough to be considered seas by volume, so they are freshwater seas, inland seas. Um, and our third coast, the coastline of the Great Lakes, is actually the largest coast in the US. Um, so a lot of early Chicago history and the way that the city developed was because of its very integral position right at the mouth of the Lake Michigan and leading down into the Mississippi River Valley, which we'll get into. Um, and because they are really more like a sea than a lake, they have sea-like weather patterns. So we'll also talk a lot about that and how humans and our hubris kind of worked against the lake all the way up until now. Um, so starting with the prehistory of the region, the Great Lakes are glacial lakes. So there was about 12, 15,000 years ago, still glaciers covering most of this section of North America. And as those glaciers started to melt, there was this ebbing and flow of the glacier mass that actually carved out the ridges of our river systems. So these ridges are known as moraines. Um, and it's just the shifting of the glacier pushing up sediment and creating ridges and valleys, which then, as the water melted, filled in and created these river systems that then connected down the continent. Um, so the earliest evidence of human interaction with the Great Lakes is kind of in contention. There's some interesting stories that I include in my other lecture. There was a story about 10 years ago where someone discovered what they thought was a stone path about, I think, 40 feet into the lake. So the lake shore has also shifted a lot in the last few thousand years. It didn't actually even out until to the shoreline we have today until about 2,500 years ago. So there were humans here at least 8,000 years ago that were making use of the lake system and the river system. And actually, previous to about 2,500 years ago, when the lakes receded another 25 miles, the lakes did directly connect to the Illinois River. So you could travel freely all the way from the coast on New York into the Great Lakes system down to New Orleans if you needed to. But then the lake receded and became the shoreline we have today. And that area that had been a runoff silted up and became marshland, but it was where the river used to be. So it kind of remembered being a river. And this area was not permanently settled by native people. It was kind of a place that they would travel through to get to other places. But it was a known portage, which is a path that you take from one body of water to another, where you have to carry your boat and your cargo across the portage. So the Chicago portage is what was utilized by early peoples, and I do want to name the peoples that inhabited this land. So before colonization, this was home to the Chippewa, Menominee, Miami, Sauk, Fox, Winnebago, Ottawa, Ojibwe, Iroquois, and Potawatomi tribes. And it was Potawatomi Native Americans that led the French settlers and explorers into the Great Lakes region and showed them the Chicago portage. So I have a little image here of this period of time over about 200 years of North American history where Chicago was little more than this portage site. As far back as 1673, when Joliet kind of arrived at the site and was shown the portage, he made the portage journey, got onto the Illinois River, was, aware that it would travel downwards, and he did make note that this would be a really excellent place for a canal. But of course, when he suggested this to the French colonial government, they were like, "We don't have money for that. We don't have time for that. That's not important." His contemporary LaSalle had a little bit better luck getting funds from the French colonial powers because he did ask for the funds to build a ship to explore the Great Lakes region. Sorry. So in 1679, LaSalle was able to build the first of two boats that he had been funded for, the first one being the Griffin. There's not a lot that we know for sure about this ship, but it was the first European tall ship to sail the Great Lakes. It's thought to have been at least 60 feet long, had anywhere between a single or 7 small cannons. I don't know why they thought they needed cannons, but there was some contention along the area. There's rumor that it had a carving of a griffin as the figurehead. And LaSalle set out from Niagara on August 7th, 1679 on that ship. And then during this time, the reason he had commissioned the ship and the kind of thing that he was mostly doing in the area was doing a lot of fur trading. So he was also in debt to the French government, and he was relying on this ship to carry this much larger cargo of furs back up to the French colony. So he reaches Mackinac Island on August 27th, and then on September 12th decided to stay behind and let the crew continue onward on this path, and then eventually arrive at Green Bay. And the crew went on 6 men on this cargo of pelts, and then they disappeared forever. So this is also the first thought to be shipwreck. The first tall ship on the Great Lakes was also the first shipwreck. There is so much mystery around the Griffin, and I do talk about this at length again in my other lecture. For many years since that time, people have been looking for it. They think they found it many times. There's some really interesting stories from the 40s and 50s from people who think they found it. And I do think that there was a site again more recently, but I don't think that it's ever been confirmed by a university or archaeological committee. But we have been looking for the griffin for 400 years. And it was sort of our introduction to the mystery of the lake system. What LaSalle assumed was that the crew had actually perhaps taken the cargo for themselves and scuttled the ship on purpose, which was also not uncommon. So whatever became of the griffin is our first lake mystery. So for the next 100 years or so after that, there is a lot of contention in the area between the French, British, and native populations. There's a lot of small wars sort of being fought between those. Eventually, the French lose and have to abandon the area. And then there's a bunch of really complicated treaties for a while that sort of shift the land. Some of the Native American tribes of the area are allied to the British powers or to the colonies, and there's also a lot of tension between them. The first permanent European settlement, the first house built at the site of the Chicago portage, was the house of Jean-Baptiste Point du Sable, a Black French-Canadian settler who had married a Potawatomi woman. I like to name them Kitihawa, or Catherine, his wife, and they built a small cabin and established a farm at the site of the Chicago River. And that was the first permanent settlement. So this became kind of a marker to fur traders who had started using the area for the portage. So again, this portage in Chicago was connecting the Great Lakes system to the Mississippi River via the Illinois River. So if they could come off of Lake Michigan and carry their canoes full of cargo across about 5 to 10 miles of very muddy marshland, they would eventually arrive at the Des Plaines River where they could access this river system. And the portage was very rough. And the area was not really conducive to settlements, which is why it took quite a while for them to build permanent settlement, even though as far back as Joliet, there was interest in the site. They understood the importance of it geographically as a connection, a way of connecting the intercontinent from New York all the way down to New Orleans. And connecting the Atlantic Ocean to the Gulf of Mexico via Chicago. So there was always a lot of interest in the area, but it wasn't really a priority. There really wasn't funds to develop it while they were dealing with revolutionary matters and establishing a young country. So that cabin that was settled by DuSable, who is now considered the founder of Chicago, was a marker for fur traders coming off of the lake, making that portage onto the Mississippi and vice versa. So he would sometimes let people into his home, offer some support, as they made that journey, and that was kind of the only marker. So again, I'm trying to keep this very conversational tonight. So there's a lot of really complicated treaties and movements kind of between people who owns the lake area. It doesn't actually become incorporated for quite a while, but when we received a lot of the Midwest in the Northwest Ordinance, there was a section of it that pertain to what would eventually become the Chicago Canal and about the canal systems and waterways that were planned for the young nation. So in the Northwest Ordinance, it says, the navigable waters leading into the Mississippi and St. Lawrence and the carrying places between the same shall be common highways and forever free. So because of this is still true today. The waterways actually have right of way because these are federal highways essentially that supersede state law. It's federal law that the rivers remain free and open because of the Northwest Ordinance. So then the Chicago settlement, now that America is established and they have access to this land, there's still some contention with local tribes. There's a lot of sort of scuffles. But also, this is kind of because of European presence in the area, because previous to European presence, there really weren't permanent settlements here, even of native people. They really used it mostly for that portage. But then, as the settlement grows and people are attracted to the area and fur traders kind of come onto native hunting grounds, there's much more contention. So the addition of Fort Dearborn in 1803 leads then to the Fort Dearborn Massacre in 1812. When the War of 1812 starts up, there is a loss in Mackinac, and then when word of that comes down to the Little Chicago settlement, they were concerned that they wouldn't be able to continue to feed the people that were in that fort. So there was a plan to evacuate the fort and I think move to Fort Wayne in Indiana. Um, and they were trying to find a safe passage out of Fort Dearborn via a native guide, but at the last minute they kind of betrayed the natives that they were allied with, and they were given warning that an ambush was planned to occur, and nevertheless they attempted to flee the fort. And then when they were ambushed, there was a immense loss of life. And then the few people that were taken hostage and taken back to the fort were then sort of haggled off, and the fort was burned down by the Potawatomi tribe. So that was the end of that first phase of Chicago settlement. So when that war concludes, about 1816, the Potawatomi ceded the land and in the Treaty of St. Louis, and then later the Treaty of Chicago, and the fort was rebuilt about 1818. So at this point, Chicago is definitely established as a trading post, and federal interest was kind of developing in eventual plans for a canal. They always wanted to build a canal here. It was just about having enough people, having the funds for it, when, of course, there's a lot of other development happening elsewhere. And at this time, too, Chicago still has a population of about 50 people. So they don't, the manpower that would be needed to even allocate this is not anywhere close to existing. So one of the more interesting stories that I found when I was researching the portage was a firsthand account from, Gurdon S. Hubbard, who became one of the founding members of Chicago industry and had went on to open the first stockyard here in Chicago. But he was a young man from the East Coast, I believe Vermont, and there was kind of an attraction for young people on the East Coast to make the portage journey to sell very, lucrative beaver furs amongst the Great Lakes ports. So he was asked along on one of these kind of hunting exhibitions, and he experienced the portage as a young man in 1818. And his direct quote describing the portage: "Those who waded through the mud frequently sank to the waist, and at times were forced to cling to the side of the boat to prevent going over their heads. After reaching the end and camping for the night came the task of ridding themselves of the bloodsuckers, which stuck so tight to the skin that experience taught the use of a decoction of tobacco to remove them." So this marshland also changes by season, it changes by year, but at some points there was Mud Lake and different passages of the portage that were harder to cross than others. So this was, again, not an easy feat. Crossing 5 to 10 miles in order to access the Illinois River and the Mississippi River was worth it, but this was not an easy feat. So eventually, though, just because of the geographic location of Chicago, the federal government kind of finally takes notice of its very ideal location between the Great Lakes and the Mississippi system. And so the formal settlement of Chicago kind of starts in earnest. They start sending people out. There was an 1824 survey of the land to build a canal. But in 1833, when Chicago was formally incorporated as a township, it still only had a population of about 350 people. And many of those people were arriving via boat, mostly canoe, down Lake Michigan. So the first commercial schooner to enter the harbor was on July 12th, 1834. Kind of signifying the beginning of the commercial boom and the very, very start of Chicago's center of commerce as a port city. The city started kind of experiencing a boom, and it happens very, very rapidly. Between 1835 and 1845, thousands of people start to come to Chicago because there are plans for this future canal. There is a lot of talk about, getting in while the land is going free. There's some very shrewd speculators who are coming to Chicago and buying up this land and kind of, selling it off because of the fact that the canal is going to be built. They know this is going to be really worthwhile to invest in eventually. The US government is also partially funding a future building of the canal by selling off this land. So at the time, this is still federal land that they're then selling off in parcels to fund the project, the future project. So the start of the building of the canal was nonetheless delayed until about 1836 due to lack of funds. There was a lot of contention between the young Illinois and Chicago settlers and the federal government. They had to keep going back and kind of begging for federal funding for the canal project. And they knew how important this was. They knew how lucrative and important it would be to eventually develop this, but it was difficult when the federal government was, again, still establishing itself and focusing on defense and foreign trade and the original colonies. So they kind of had to keep begging for money, and they eventually sought out um, other private financiers. So they received a few private loans. But the problem with the private loans was that the people that were funding the project did not want to give private loans to private citizens. They were requiring that the loan would actually be to the Illinois government. So then it would become a general bond, and there would be, slightly a more official obligation to it. So the Illinois government was really, really trying to avoid this. And then they were like, okay, fine, because they really are trying to, get to the point where they can start the construction of this canal, because they knew that that would also attract more industry to the area. So construction was then began in 1836 and then halted because of the economic crisis of 1837, which then almost bankrupted the state of Illinois. So we had a lot of starts and stops in our early history. So it kind of continues to trudge along the plans for the canal. And at this point, they're begging the federal government for more money, and the federal government's like, we're not going to give you more money. So they were actually forced to look into foreign investors in Europe. So there were some British and French investors that actually gave them the funds to start the construction of the original Illinois and Michigan Canal. They also had to scale back the project. So the original conception of the canal would have been a very complicated system to even out the canal that was being built with the water levels of both the lake and the Illinois River. And the scaled back version was able to kind of climb over the summit of the mid-continental divide by using a lot more locks than they had originally planned. And it was also much more shallow than they had originally planned. So the original conception of the canal when it was surveyed was that there was going to be a canal that was 14 feet deep, and the Illinois-Michigan Canal that was eventually built was actually only 6 feet deep. 6 feet deep for 96 miles. Yeah. So the canal was completed in 1848, running 96 miles between the Chicago River around Bridgeport to the Illinois River in LaSalle, which was the site of one of the major portages. And following a path of 17 locks and 4 aqueducts to control the water level and the traffic, which included towpaths along the edge for mules to tow cargo on barges down the canal. The canal was 60 feet wide and only 6 feet deep. There was a series of projects to improve it over the course of its existence, so it was also deepened in 1871. So now Chicago is in business, kinda. So this is an example when we say, the tow paths, there were literal paths where the mules would tow the barges along the site of the canal. And a lot of the other major players of Illinois, cities that sprung up along the canal path, because these were now port towns that could both receive shipments from foreign markets, and it expanded a lot of Illinois' agriculture because now they had access to further markets. So grain from Illinois could make its way across the country and as far as Europe. Grain from Illinois actually did eventually reach Atlantic trading ports and make its way over to Britain. So we were feeding the British for, the mid 19th century. So the ability to transport goods and people freely between the Mississippi and the East Coast markets expanded the agricultural markets. And the main exports that we were able to transfer besides grain were lumber. A lot of lumber from Wisconsin and Michigan forests that were able to float down Lake Michigan and then down the Mississippi or across the lake system to New York. So even if it wasn't built in Chicago, the Chicago lumber economy built a lot of the country during this time as well. This is pre-stockyards. Stockyards are kind of what our economy is based on in the next century, but they were also able to transport livestock. So it was not uncommon to transport livestock from Chicago and Illinois markets down the Mississippi. And this is also happening concurrently with a lot of other canal construction. So the beginning of our maritime history starts from, trudging canoes across this portage to now the golden age of canals in the US. So canals are being built across the US as it exists at the time, and this becomes the major kind of transportation highway for people. People would do pretty much anything to avoid actually going over land or traveling, across the Appalachian Mountains to get into the interior. So there was these really complicated networks of canal boats where you could book passage from one canal boat to another, accessing all these little river systems, kind of starting with the construction of the Erie Canal and then the Chicago, Illinois, Michigan Canal, and then a lot of smaller ones that kind of sprung up. So this is our golden age of canal boats. And as Chicago is finishing its canal project, the railroad is kind of coming up at the exact same time. So we keep trying to do things, and we always kind of just manage it at the exact moment something else is coming up that will eventually replace it. And it's just a race. But even as the rail was being set along the canal path, it still wasn't actually cost efficient to do most things by rail. It was still more cost efficient to use the canal and use mule power over steam or coal power. So the canal still, was the major highway of commerce for the movement of goods and people until eventually the rail system overtakes it a little while later. And this also almost immediately makes Chicago one of the busiest ports, not just in the country, but in the world, because so many things are passing through. And now this is the connection from the rest of the country to the Great Lakes system, up into Canada, across into the newer colonies, into the eastern markets, and then of course over to Europe. So this is kind of the beginning of our golden age of sail. And besides the canal boats, there starts to be a lot more activity of sailing ships on the Great Lakes and in the port of Chicago, which I'll get to in a second. But Chicago now is a town. It's growing, and it's known as a port town. But, the reach of the federal government is still pretty far off. So it was kind of the Wild West of its day. And it kind of was the first, not the way that I want to phrase this. Chicago was known as a seedy place. It was not an attractive destination, and people coming from smaller towns and more established towns and cities on the East Coast were warned of Chicago when they were coming to make port, that it was a dangerous place, that it was kind of transient, that there were a lot of seedy bars and brothels along the harbors that serviced people that were coming and going quite a lot. There was a kind of common admonishment that you should not disembark in the Chicago port without a pistol at the ready. Yep. Yeah. So that reputation, is always kind of part of our scrappy outlook. Um, so um, we're also growing despite some other conditions which are not really conducive to the growth of a major port city. The lake is incredibly dangerous. Lake Michigan in particular is the most dangerous of the Great Lakes. Because the lake is very long north to south, but has an east-west weather pattern. So when storms are out on the Great Lakes, it makes it almost impossible for ships to avoid the storm or able to outrun it. There are incredible swells on Lake Michigan, more so than any of the other Great Lakes, even Lake Superior, with waves reaching up to 40 feet at times, a lot of sudden storms. I'm going to just keep mentioning things that I talk about in my other talk, but we have our Lake Michigan Triangle, which does have some paranormal, spooky, interesting stories around it, but is geographically a location in the middle of the lake system where there statistically is the most accidents. Just again, because of these kind of bizarre weather patterns on the lake that are unique to Lake Michigan. And Lake Michigan is also the most lethal of the Great Lakes statistically. The most shipwrecks by a huge margin because of the weather system, and also the most drownings annually. So we are building a major metropolis and beginning an age of sail commerce on a body of water that is not conducive to human settlement and does not care about us. And also at the same time, the government is like, we don't care at all. Like, there is no standard for safety, there's no legislation for safety, and even minimal efforts to improve harbor safety and lake safety were kind of ignored by the federal government to a certain point. There concurrently is the advent of steam power. So steam and sail are both existent on the Great Lakes port, and the steamships were kind of more useful for transporting certain kinds of stuff and transporting people on the canal, but the sailing ships, mostly two-masted schooners, were the preferred ship on the Great Lakes system because they were really fast. They could carry cargo very quickly. They could be easily docked in small harbors because there really aren't natural major harbors along the lake. So they have to be really efficient, and they have to be able to kind of, again, be really scrappy wherever they're going, because otherwise you would have to row out and disembark that way. So the specialized schooners kind of develop because of the conditions of Lake Michigan, and they quickly realized that some of the sailing ships that were coming down from the St. Lawrence were not the best kinds of ships to have on Lake Michigan. And they're also really practical. They're not thinking about grandeur. They're not thinking about exploratory missions. They're thinking about how can we move the most stuff the most efficiently. So the Great Lakes schooners and the shipyards that start to develop around Chicago are making these really fast little practical boats. They tend to be a little weirdly shaped because they come off from the Great Lakes system and then have to enter the river harbor and then the canals, which are very shallow. So there was actually a specialized kind of schooner that was developed that had a centerboard, the piece kind of in the middle, that was retractable, exactly. So they could lower it on the lake for stabilization and then raise it when they entered the harbor and onto the canals. They also realized that a fore and aft sail rigging was preferable on the lake system to the square rigging of most sailing ships out on the ocean. So all this means is that most ships traditionally had square sails, and the lake was more conducive to triangular sails. We also see the development of paddle boats as the steamships kind of develop. There were barges, and there even were some early freighters that were large ships only used to carry heavier cargo. But it's still at this point is more cost efficient to put smaller loads of cargo on these fast little schooners that can zip it around the lake ports. Another specialized vessel that I'll mention now, but get into a little bit more later, that's just really interesting to me, is the whaleback, which was particular to the Great Lakes. It was a kind of freighter that resembled a whale because it had a convex upper, and then it kind of resembled a submarine that floated across the lake. It never, was submerged, but it had this convex roof and very little actual space for people, but the shape of it could load a lot of cargo and then lay very low in the water. So it was safer to travel with this heavy cargo because it was less likely to destabilize on the lake water. And that was developed by a Scottish immigrant to the area, Alexander McDougall, who founded his own shipyard in Manitowoc when he kept bringing his design for this weird little boat to all these different shipyards and nobody would build it. So he said, I'm just going to build it myself. Uh, and it never really took off, but it is kind of a fascinating particular of the Great Lakes maritime industry. Um, so this image that I have up behind me is an example of a grain elevator, which was kind of unique to the Chicago market and the span of rivers that we had for these harbors. So when ships would enter the Chicago River, instead of being loaded by manpower, they would pull up to these grain elevators, which would then just deposit the cargo onto the ship to then continue onto the market. So this was kind of the beginning of our skyline. This is what littered the early river market. Um, and they're just so funny, really. These grain elevators existed into the 20th century and became, much more bigger industrial kind of things. But these early ones, where they would just kind of slide the cargo down onto the boat, onto the river. So Chicago does eventually have its own shipyards. These early schooners were mostly built in Wisconsin and elsewhere on the lake system, and then were traveled to Chicago. But we do eventually have our own shipbuilding industry, mostly on Goose Island, a few other places. There were a handful of shipyards that were skilled shipbuilders from the East Coast that came to Chicago to kind of again get in on this early industry. Also, kind of failed to mention at this point, Chicago is just booming. So because of this maritime industry that's making all this commerce and going possible, Chicago has gone from 50 people to 1 million people in 40 years. And also, just a kind of side note, a thing of interest to me was that they also kind of realized that the lake has very unique conditions as far as the maintenance of these boats because the lake is really cold and it's fresh water. So some of the issues that they would have on saltwater were non-existent. The trade-off, of course, is the crazy lake weather system. But the result of that is that boats tended to last longer. They could last a really long time. They could be repurposed. They could, change hands a bunch of times and be chartered for different kinds of travel. And even on the steel hull freighters that eventually make their way into the lake system, the saltwater corrosion that they would experience on open seas does not exist in the lake waters. So they also just on average have a much longer lifespan than other kinds of ships. Also of interest is the nature of towing in Chicago kind of changes. So those early examples of the mules towing the barges along, Chicago developed a really expansive tow system because of the amount of traffic in the harbor. So it became law that ships entering the Chicago harbor, meaning coming off of Lake Michigan into the river harbor, had to be towed because it was a way to avoid collision. So they would have to pay for a tow to enter the harbor and then sometimes even require extra tow out of the harbor once they had picked up their cargo. Um, And often that was actually the most expensive part of shipping to Chicago, was chartering the towboats. Um, there is a really interesting, again, just the hubris of man. We're constantly at this time, working against the conditions around us and just going for it anyway. Because the other problem that they kept coming up on as the harbor developed was something called the Battle of the Bar. And it was that the natural sandbar at the Chicago harbor, the mouth of the Chicago River, was really difficult for these large ships to get over. And it was also constantly shifting. So this is back when the river feeds into Lake Michigan. So it's constantly pushing the sediment over, and there was a natural ridge as you entered the harbor. And if the sandbar was high enough, it would accidentally scuttle ships that were trying to enter Chicago. So this is obviously a huge operation to maintain. And once again, they go knocking to the federal government and say, hey, can we have a bunch of money for harbor improvements? And sometimes they would get funding, sometimes they would have to finance it themselves. But regardless, every time they made any major improvement to the harbor, a year or two would go by and the sandbar would reestablish itself. So this was really not an easy fix for quite a while. The traffic, sanitation, and large-scale maritime commerce that's happening at this time was obviously very important to Chicagoans and Chicago industry leaders who were asking for help in fixing the harbor, maintaining the harbor, expanding the canal system. And some of these measures went to Congress and then were vetoed by President Polk, who, in a congressional appropriation bill, denied the Great Lakes region a lot of these improvements because he wanted to leave it up to, again, the states themselves to fund these improvements. It was not considered important enough to be a federal project. So this upset a lot of people and a lot of very powerful, rich people that were already entrenched in the maritime industry of Chicago. And it leads to a river and harbor convention that was held in Chicago in 1947. This, at the time, was the biggest influx of people to Chicago. It was the biggest event that a very young city had ever hosted. There are estimates that there were between 5,000 and 20,000 people, which is obviously a huge range, but it's very difficult to ascertain exactly how many people there were. Regardless, they did not have the space for this many people, and it did attract a lot of villagers. 1847. Did I say 19? Sorry. Sorry, folks. No, sorry. 1847 was the River and Harbor Convention held in Chicago. So the first major political event of its scale in Chicago, attracting all these different visitors. We did not have the hotel space to accommodate this many visitors to the city. So people were invited into private homes and also invited to actually stay in ships on the harbor. The convention opened with a parade spanning 12 blocks to commemorate it. And City Hall at the time was also not big enough to fit the convention, so it was held in a tent outside of City Hall. The convention was attended by a young state representative who was looking to gain some public attention, who gave a short address, and who would go on to address Congress on the issue of waterway safety and investment, and that was the young Abraham Lincoln. So while the impact was not immediate, several years later, President Fillmore, who had also been present at the convention, did end up appropriating about $2.2 million to river and harbor improvements in the Great Lakes system. So now we're into the actual height of Chicago's golden age of sail. We have shipyards, we've got the lumber industry, we've got grain, we've got lots of other goods coming and going from the city. We've got tens of thousands of ships registered on the Great Lakes that are docking in the Chicago harbor every day. And we also have a huge influx of immigrants that are coming to Chicago via boat along the Great Lakes system. Workers were also coming to Chicago to be part of this maritime industry, to work on the canals that were being dug. Should say too that the people who dug the Illinois and Michigan Canal were mostly Irish immigrants who had previously worked on the Erie Canal and then traveled to Chicago to work on that project. Um, and just the amount of tonnage of goods that was making its way to Chicago to then be distributed to other markets was so immense. And it probably was at the time the busiest port in the world. Today, Chicago is actually still the third largest intermodal port in the world. Because we hide a lot of that industry, we don't see it as Chicagoans, but behind Singapore and Hong Kong, we are the largest intermodal port, which means that the largest port where goods are constantly trading, how they are being moved and transferred. Um, so lots of these cargoes were chartered privately. People would kind of come and go working on the boats. The schooners were incredibly efficient and they could work with a crew of as few as 5 or 6 people. Um, so it was also, again, still more efficient to use the schooners because you could have a skeleton crew. You didn't have to pay for coal or fuel, and you didn't have to feed that many people. So even as steamships and eventually these large freighters, are appearing more and more, the schooners are still at the command. Wolf Point at the fork of the river became known as the Chicago Lumber Exchange. Wolf Point, so called because 75 years earlier, when Chicago was still just a teeny tiny fur trading post, a wolf wandered into somebody's bar at the fork of the river. And we, at that point on the river today, there actually is a skyscraper called Wolf Point East. So, the way that things kind of linger in their place names is so interesting. But Wolf Point was the heart of the lumber industry in Chicago, that was registering 100 vessels a day on average. And at its peak in the 1880s, the Port of Chicago was handling 20,000 ship clearances annually. So we're trudging along. Everything's great. We are a major harbor and port, 20,000 ships annually. You can see here in this bird's eye view from pre-1871 how congested the river is. There was already starting to be talk of digging a second canal along the South Branch near the Calumet River to kind of lessen some of the traffic on the Chicago River. And you see the types of ships that are coming into harbor, mostly these 2-masted schooners. A few 3- and 4-masted ships were kind of rare to see. You see the steam-powered tugboats with the smokestacks coming off of them. And, at this point, Chicago is a major harbor city, a major coastal city, and the main industry is its port. All of the smaller industries are only able to flourish because of the wide reach of its market at this time when much of the country is still developing. And this is why Chicago won out as the power of the Midwest. Other Midwest cities that were in competition with Chicago, Cincinnati and St. Louis, Detroit, they were established sooner, but they didn't have the exact geographical power that we had. And once that canal is established and once the harbor town is established, we just are unstoppable until the Great Chicago Fire of 1871. So like most of downtown, the harbors were badly damaged in the fire, including many of the shipbuilding businesses, which almost didn't come back. Many of the industries left. There was really just a handful of people that decided to stay and invest in rebuilding Chicago. And then this starts kind of another building boom because the plan to rebuild Chicago back better is very attractive to a lot of industrious and innovative young architects and thinkers and industrialists. And there is about a 20-year building boom where they are building Chicago again and rebuilding all these industries. And then by the time we have kind of accomplished this feat, it is time for the 400th anniversary of settlement of North America, and we famously start to vie for hosting the World Fair. And many of us talk about the World's Fair. We could, do so many lectures about the World's Fair. Of course, I'm going to talk about it as it pertains to maritime history, but the World's Fair was Chicago's opportunity to debut the new city on a world stage as a major metropolis and superpower and seat of culture. So the maritime history of Chicago and the future maritime industry of Chicago has also started to shift. And we are kind of moving away now from being a port city moving cargo, as far as the actual river and the use of the Illinois-Michigan Canal. A lot of that industry is being transferred south, into the industrial corridor, and into the newer South Branch Canal, which we'll get to. But now they can kind of reinvent Chicago's shoreline as a pleasure district. So the shoreline and the river are kind of cleaned out from all of this industrial skyline of ship masts and heavy cargo and transient schooners, to being a place where you could ferry very easily across the Great Lakes. We now have the population where that's actually something that's more of a priority. And when we have the World's Fair in 1893, they needed a way to bring passengers, bring more people into the city. And so there was the commissioning of some of these major ferries. And the biggest and most impressive was this ship, the Christopher Columbus. So this was an excursion cruise liner that was built for the fair by Alexander McDougall, who had invented the whaleback ship. And in some capacity, this is following his famous whaleback design. You can see the kind of concave hull of the boat on the bottom. So, the freighters, the famous whalebacks that he had, it was just that. Most just that with maybe a small cabin, but this is one that's built to carry as many people as possible. And it could carry 5,000 people. And make the trip from the Rush Street Harbor to the Jackson Park Fair campus in about 20 minutes. So it did this trip multiple times per day. A little bit more info about the ship itself, because it was touted as the greatest maritime wonder on the lakes at the time. So the cabins and public spaces were fitted with oak paneling, velvet carpets, etched glass windows, leather furniture and marble. There were shops and restaurants on board. There was also several water features, fountains, and an aquarium featuring freshwater fish. You know, I can spend a lot of money in 20 minutes. So. So she was, again, considered the most and commercialized as the most impressive marine wonder at the time, and dubbed the Queen of the Lakes. During the entire fair, she was reported to only have one fatality, really impressive, and it was a crewman. I don't know how that person passed, but it's the only fatality reported. At the time, this is really good. We're going to get to deaths later. So she is able to provide this passage from visitors arriving in downtown Chicago to the fairgrounds. And then after the World's Fair, she actually continued to work as a ferry on the lakes for about 40 years. So pretty good turnaround for a boat of this size. She mostly worked as a ferry between Chicago and Milwaukee. So it was a pleasure cruise, kind of something for leisure. People often at this time took ferries to other places in Wisconsin and Michigan for picnicking. The easiest way to access many of these other towns and places along the lake shoreline was actually by ferry before the roads of today were set out. And I've often said I wish that many of these did still exist, because it would be so much nicer to take a ferry to Milwaukee or to Michigan, than to drive the span of Lake Michigan, which I've also done. But it was an era where most of the lake commerce and traffic was actually for just the movement of people between different cities and places. She unfortunately was scrapped in 1933, with the Great Depression kind of taking away a lot of that leisure commerce for the city. But this is also when Chicago reinvents itself as a tourist destination. So the shoreline is completely transformed from an industrial harbor to a pleasure harbor. And we were called the Atlantic City of the Midwest. Um, so Patty and I on our Edgewater tour talk a lot about the Edgewater Beach Hotel. There were a lot of such resort hotels along the shoreline, especially before the shoreline was really fully designated as public lands, where these resorts would pop up and people would come to vacation in Chicago for a freshwater shoreline. So Chicago, the vacation city, in the 10s, 20s, and 30s, is where a lot of our tourism is coming from. Um, and the steamships and schooners disappear for recreational yachts and pleasure boats, the water taxis that would take people from the resorts to downtown. There was a water taxi from the Edgewater Beach Hotel to downtown Chicago that made trips every day. And these were the primary vessels. So, moving on now to the other greatest maritime feat of our history, the reversal of the river. So, when you're doing a maritime survey, maritime loosely means anything happening on the sea, and the lakes are freshwater seas, but the river was really part of our harbor. So I do think that a lot of the river industry is included in our maritime legacy. And as the North Branch kind of loses its industry and becomes mostly business commerce and private homes and buildings. The South Branch kind of becomes our industrial corridor, and a lot of this industry has moved to the South Branch. And this is the advent of the stockyards as well. And we start dumping all of this industrial waste into the South Branch of the river. Um, so the so-called Bubbly Creek, the fork of the South Branch of the Chicago River, where meatpackers had dumped so much blood and animal waste in the water that it began to bubble methane, and it is still bubbling today. There have been many efforts to clean it, but it's the bubbling was caused by decomposition of animal matter, and you're like, okay, but that was 100 years ago, and there was just such a huge amount of waste that it actually created its own sort of sediment layer on the riverbed that is still in the process of being cleaned up. So yes, this is still an issue today, and there are still people making efforts to clean up Bubbly Creek. But the amount of industrial waste elsewhere on the river as well, it was just incredibly disgusting. It was really, really gross, and a lot of people became ill and died of cholera and typhoid and other diseases coming from the bad water supply. This is my new favorite image in my historical research of Chicago. This is an image of the river and one of the fire boats putting out the river because it is on fire. Because the surface of the water had almost a solid layer of grease and industrial waste that became flammable in the summer. So the river would literally catch fire. um, and Chicago, in its wisdom, is trying to figure out how we can improve this. And what we come up with is reversing the flow of the Chicago River and diverting all of this waste down the Mississippi so that it's somebody else's problem and keeping our freshwater supply in Lake Michigan clean. I mean, it is important, and it still is very important to protect the Great Lakes. The Great Lakes make up 1/5 of the Earth's fresh drinking water. But we definitely hit up some contention from states down south. There was a lot of legal battles against this happening, and we just powered through. Um, so the construction of the sanitary and ship canal that would redirect the flow of the South Branch of the river, running it off into the Des Plaines and south to the Illinois instead of back into the lake, was accomplished in the early part of the 20th century, effectively reversing the flow of the river. And it also happened at the same time as the straightening of the South Branch. The South Branch was literally leveled out and straightened to make it more habitable to larger freighters and barges that were being floated down. So we are frequently changing the footprint of the Chicago shoreline to suit our needs. Um, oop, useful there. Um, so when the sanitary and shipping canal that changes the flow of the river is finished, the original Illinois and Michigan Canal is effectively out of commission. And the canal had been languishing for quite a while at this point, and then once it is formally closed, parts of it were filled in. There are parts of it that still exist, mostly as a kind of fascinating historical site. There are some of the locks and towns that grew up along the canal are now historical places. Patty and I did a road trip a few years ago where we found some of the sites of the original Illinois-Michigan Canal that run along the original railroad tracks, and you can stand in what used to be the canal bed. So really, really interesting local history to check out. But the canal that had been such a huge project and this huge feat and made Chicago what it is, we just said, okay, that's not useful anymore. We're, moving forward. And that secondary canal then became most of where our shipping industry is centered today, which is why we don't see it. A lot of it is sequestered in this industrial corridor, and on the other side of the lake as well, on the Indiana side, where a lot of that steel and iron ore industry sprung up. So we still are, as I said, one of the major ports. We just hide that industry much better than in the major age of sail, where you would see these ships on the harbor at all the time. So, moving into the 20th century, here's an example of some barges on that sanitary and shipping canal being tugged along. So in 1893, the director of the World's Fair was a architect named Daniel Burnham, who had really made a name for himself, working on early Chicago skyscraper projects. We love Daniel Burnham and his big, big plans for Chicago. And after the World's Fair in 1909, Burnham finished his Plan of Chicago, which was this really, really lofty plan to redesign the city and beautify the city and make it more accessible and catered toward the future growth of the city, but in a way that would be planned and set out. And part of this plan encouraged the beautification of the shoreline. The fact that the shoreline of Chicago would remain public lands for Chicagoans to access. There's no private property along the lakeshore, except for a few little houses. There's 2 private homes on the lakeshore. But also part of this plan was the building of 9 municipal piers. He wanted to build 9 municipal piers along the shoreline that would, again, kind of stop the traffic and congestion of ships to any of the different river harbors and canals. And they began building Municipal Pier number 2. The very first one to be built. And the reason it was called Municipal Pier number 2, even though it was the first and then only one to be built, was that there was going to be Municipal Pier 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 going from south to north. And that just happened to be the first site that they started working on. And then World War I happens. So once again, things you can make big plans, make no little plans, but the world will have bigger plans for you. And World War I halts the construction of Municipal Pier number 1, and then eventually the entire project is kind of abandoned, and we end up with our singular Municipal Pier number 2, which just then becomes our municipal pier. So the size and the relatively open air design of the pier made it really useful for large scale events and gatherings, even in its beginning phases. So after World War I, it becomes the site of the World's Fair in 1933, which was attended by my grandparents, and I heard lots about it growing up. Um, and then when war breaks out again in World War II, the pier was converted into a Navy training site. So it was renamed Navy Pier because of its use as a military training site. And it was really an ideal place to train Navy and Air Force pilots because it was a coastal, military base that was safe from the enemy, sensitive coasts on the west and east coasts, so they could train these people inland where they were more protected. So there was some makeshift barges, makeshift, sorry, yes, um, makeshift air carriers. Obviously shorter than the air carriers that would have been out on open ocean, but good enough to train Navy cadets. But once again, also this really, really interesting part of this time, because it was really successful. But at the same time, the lake is so different than an ocean, and it was also really difficult to learn. So probably ideal that it was so difficult to learn at the site. And it's thought that at least 250 bomber planes went down during the trainings. Um, Yes. So after the conclusion of World War II, the military moves out, and the University of Illinois actually moved in. So then, for about 20 years, the University of Illinois was located at Navy Pier, and classes were held here as the university grew. In 1965, the amount of students had kind of outgrown the Pier campus, so they were looking for somewhere to build a new campus for the University of Illinois. And we ended up with our Circle campus at what is now the University of Illinois Chicago. And then once the university goes, the pier is kind of once again languishing. It was originally built to house, freight. So there were freight sheds along the pier. And it kind of sits empty until the 1970s when it starts to host music festivals. Yeah, so has anybody in this room been to Chicago Fest at Navy Pier? Oh, I love that. I have so many things to ask you. I'm very jealous. I'm so jealous. I'm sure you had an amazing time. Um, yeah. So the success of Chicago Fest, Rock Around the Dock in the 70s made the pier a major convention center, festival center. Huge rock acts from around the world came to Chicago Fest to perform. Pre-Lollapalooza was our major, music festival. Um, and the success of Chicago Fest kind of made the city start to consider converting Navy Pier from a kind of, temporary site for all these different things into a open air festival marketplace, a leisure pier. And Mayor Byrne tried to make this happen, but when she loses, or not loses, but when she's replaced with Mayor Washington, he kind of halted the project. And then it gets picked up again by Mayor Daley. So in the 90s, the pier finally goes under this major renovation. I'm not going to say restoration because they destroyed almost all of the original 1909 freight sheds and infrastructure. And the pier was reimagined as a tourist spot. And they put in, a lot of tourist attractions, and the amusement grounds and the addition of the Ferris wheel. And that's the way I grew up with it. And I remember going to Navy Pier and kind of being like overwhelmed. It was a thing that definitely felt like Chicagoans go there once or twice, and then it's mostly for out of towners to go and gawk at, and um, that's kind of how it stayed in my mind for a long time. But more recently, there was a contest for proposals in the early aughts to once again reimagine Navy Pier and make it more attractive for Chicagoans and make it more of a place that Chicagoans would take pride in and visit. And the proposal that they took on completed its phase one, which was to create the Polk Brothers Park at the entrance of Navy Pier. So it used to be that you'd go, under the bridge and there'd be a whole lot of nothing, and then you'd enter the pier. And now there's this really beautiful park with a lot of natural water features as you enter the pier. And they also wanted to move where ships on the pier would dock so that they would have a clearer view of the skyline. So the waveform on the pier is now accessible to Chicagoans. It's also where we have our fireworks shows in the summertime. And phase two is set to continue to beautify Navy Pier in the future. Lighthouses. I told Patty last night that I was going to keep this under an hour. We're veering up on like an hour and 20 minutes, so I am coming to a close. But so the Chicago Harbor being a major port, safety, quickly becomes a concern. And as typically happens with a lot of history, they learn from disasters as they occur. So as things happen, they kind of learn from their mistakes and new safety standards are established. Their original building of a lighthouse in Chicago happened all the way back in 1832, right before the city was incorporated as a township. This original lighthouse is actually now the site of the DuSable Memorial at the bridge. On Michigan Avenue, where also the original Fort Dearborn monument stands. So that's where the original lighthouse was, right at the entrance to the river. That was erected in 1832 and was about 50 feet high. There was several other lighthouses that were built over the following decades as the harbor expanded, but the problem was that they were trying to build them on the shoreline, which tended to be marshy. And sometimes they would start building a lighthouse and then it would just collapse. So they started figuring out these more skeletal iron structure lighthouses. The most recent Chicago Harbor lighthouse that we know today was actually built for the World's Fair in 1893. And featured a Fresnel lens that was also exhibited at the fair. French glassmakers. That lens was then kept in the lighthouse actually for a few decades before it made its way to a museum in California now. But it was built for the World's Fair and then sat in the harbor there until the Coast Guard actually moved it to the crib where it now stands in 1917. So they took it apart and moved it and rebuilt it here at the crib. I also talk a lot about the cribs in my other lecture and the secret lake tunnels. So, it's hard to not talk about all those things right now. But the lighthouses along the Chicago and much of the Illinois and Michigan shorelines were really pivotal and also led to the formation of volunteer life-saving stations. So something unique about Lake Michigan is that a lot of these schooners would actually hug the shoreline as they made these journeys because it was too dangerous to go out onto the open water. And there were still a lot of shipwrecks because of the sandbar and storms hitting the ships and rock formations. And a lot of the shipwrecks would actually happen really close to the shore. And you would think that this would lessen the fatalities, but the coldness of the water and the lack of vision in natural harbors actually led to a lot more fatalities. So there started to be these little outcroppings of life-saving stations that would be watching for ships and could then assist if there was a ship signaling distress or if they saw a wreck. And there are actually examples of this. There were hundreds of ships that were aided by the life-saving stations, which then eventually are incorporated into the Coast Guard, where they would, send out rescue boats to these ships that had wrecked right along the shoreline. So the Chicago Harbor Lighthouse is incorporated into the Coast Guard in 1917, moved to this spot. The lighthouses were automated in 1939, so nobody had to live in the lighthouse anymore to manage it. And then it just continues on its way, and was registered as a historic landmark in 2003. In 2005, the Coast Guard said, we really can't do anything with this and we kind of need to get rid of it. And they gave it back to the city of Chicago. So the city of Chicago owns the Chicago Harbor Lighthouse. But more recently, in 2022, there is a local nonprofit called Friends of the Chicago Harbor Lighthouse that is trying to mount an effort to restore the lighthouse, and are trying to get the city to transfer it to the nonprofit so that restoration efforts can begin. That's still in progress, so always important to keep up with what is happening to our Chicago landmarks. If you're interested in the Chicago Harbor Lighthouse and Friends of the Chicago Harbor Lighthouse, I encourage you to look into that. And of course, the lighthouse's main job was to try to prevent shipwrecks on the Great Lakes. So now to conclude my talk, I'm going to just talk about a few very famous shipwrecks. Lake Michigan, as I said, is the most dangerous, has the highest number of shipwrecks. There have been literally thousands since the European settlers came to the Great Lakes region, starting with Le Griffin at the time of LaSalle, and the kind of sudden storms and big swells and weird lake weather, of course, are what make it so dangerous. So it's really impossible to know actually just how many shipwrecks there are and what the loss of life has been, because many of these ships weren't registered in the Great Lakes. They were traveling from other places and never even made it to their ports. It also tended to be that there were not survivors because of how cold the lake was. So again, even if they wrecked somewhere close to shore, the water was so cold that it didn't tend to support people actually making it to shore. So very, very dangerous. Lots of shipwrecks. Um, so um, hmm? The most recent one? Oh, that I don't have an answer for you, but there typically at least tends to be less of a loss of life now that the Coast Guard has modern technology. But I can tell you about some of the worst ones in a second. um, um, I mean, there was a few years ago where there was a boat on the river that caught fire during a festival. Things happen all the time. There's a lot of like lake rescues. Still actually the annual lake drownings in Lake Michigan increase every year. And in 2024, half of the Great Lakes drownings were on Lake Michigan again. So, it's dangerous. We listen to the lifeguards and we listen to the flags and we don't swim in swells and we don't walk our babies in strollers when it's 15 degrees out on Belmont Pier. That was a recent story that baffled me. If you know about the young man who jumped into the lake to save a baby that had fallen over early in February. The baby's okay. He's okay. But I'm going to first bring up one of these shipwrecks that then affected safety standards and regulations, the Lady Elgin. So the Lady Elgin was a wooden-hulled side-wheel steamship carrying about 400 passengers that was rammed in a storm by a cargo schooner called the Augusta in 1860. So the Lady Elgin had left Milwaukee to bring these passengers to Chicago for a political convention. They spent the day in the city, and then they were making their way back to the Milwaukee port when they collided with the Augusta that was traveling to the Chicago port. There had been a sudden storm, and both of the ships were hugging the shoreline because of the storm. And even though the Lady Elgin was very heavily lit, apparently the Augusta did not see it coming or could not divert its course in time, and there was a collision between these two ships. The Augusta continued on its way towards Chicago, but the Lady Elgin immediately broke apart and started to sink. And there was a really intense and immense overnight effort to save as many people as possible. She did have lifeboats. Many people made it into lifeboats. There was also a raft that was kind of taking in people from the ice water all night. The captain of the Lady Elgin worked really tirelessly to try to save as many people as possible. He was hauling people onto the raft. Unfortunately, he eventually did succumb and was pulled under by lake currents while rescuing other passengers. Uh, and there were about 300 fatalities of the 400 passengers on the ship. So about 98 people survived. Um, there were so many Irish politicians from Milwaukee on board the Lady Elgin that perished in this event that it's actually credited with single-handedly changing power in Milwaukee from Irish immigrants to German immigrants. Um, and so the Augusta, when she made port in Chicago, was under some hot water because they were very confused why she had continued her course, why this collision had occurred. So the crew was, heavily interrogated, and they had claimed that they continued on their way because they had assumed that the damage to their ship was actually more substantial than the Lady Elgin, that she was probably fine, but they wanted to try to get to Chicago as soon as possible to do repairs on their own ship. And this leads to a lot of talk and eventually some legislation about lighting of ships. So there's no standard for any of this stuff until something terrible happens. And after this event, it became the law that these schooners had to have running lights in the case of storms. And that's just kind of how it goes. Terrible things happen, people die, and then we make a law about it instead of making the law to prevent that from happening. So the next kind of fun shipwreck story that I wanted to share tonight was the story of the famous Chicago Christmas ships. Kind of a fascinating little piece of industry in the 19th century was these Christmas tree ships that would get loads of Christmas trees from Wisconsin and then sell them along the river harbors. There was a lot of German immigrants, and the Christmas tree was a German tradition. So they kind of popularized it in the Chicago area by selling the trees off of these ships. And they would often pull up to the harbor and sell the trees from the ship directly because it was, kind of attractive and whimsical, but also so that they could avoid wholesalers and, make a quicker turnaround. And there were two brothers, August and Herman Schunemann, who were longtime mariners, and the Christmas tree industry and some of these other smaller kind of stranger charters happened towards the end of the age of sail, because the schooner industry was dying out, but a lot of these schooners were still making their way around. So they would do sort of random charters, and they were just trying to make the most of these boats while they were still there. And they became very cheap. They were actually called tramp boats because of how often they would change hands. And sometimes show up to Chicago ports with kind of questionable cargo that maybe was poached or pirated from other ships, and the port of Chicago just turned a blind eye to that. So it's kind of the languishing last dregs of our age of sail, is these little boats that are bringing these smaller, stranger cargoes to the city. And the Christmas tree ships were usually the last ships to dock in the harbor for the year, because the other human hubris of Chicago was that the lake is icy for, a fourth of the year, and the shipping industry would just die during that time. Now we have icebreaker steel hull freighters that just move stuff on the lakes all year round. But these were usually the last boats to dock. And these two brothers, August and Herman Schunemann, had become Christmas tree traders as the other marine industries were dying down. And they, in 1911, August Schunemann took a load of Christmas trees on its way to Chicago, and they weren't being very safe. They were trying to load as much stuff on these very old, scrappy boats as possible. And unfortunately, he was hit by a sudden storm and was wrecked and lost his life. His brother, Herman, continued to sell Christmas trees until the very next year, when he chartered a little boat that should have probably been scuttled and condemned, called the Rouse Simmons. He loaded it up with Christmas trees in Wisconsin, And then as he was hugging the shoreline, making his way down to Chicago, was hit with a sudden storm. Um, and they actually were seen from the shore battling the storm for a while. One of these life-saving stations saw the Rouse Simmons in the morning, um, with her flag at half mast signaling distress. She was laying really low in the water. They were seen to actually be throwing the Christmas trees off of the ship to try to lighten the load and get out of the storm. And unfortunately, by the time the life-saving stations reported the ship's distress signal and rescue boats were sent out, the boat had disappeared. There was a total loss of life on this wreck as well. And we actually do know where this wreck is. It was discovered, and there's been some archaeological efforts on it. But in any case, this was the untimely demise of Chicago's most famous Christmas tree ship. When she heard the news of her husband's demise, his wife, Barbara, decided to continue selling Christmas trees off of ships at the harbor. Except that the trees would be brought there by rail and then transferred onto the ship for old time's sake. Finally, I cannot give a maritime survey of Chicago without talking about the Eastland disaster, which is the greatest loss of life in U.S. maritime history, and also a story about the exploitation of workers, about class differences and labor movements in the early century, um, and just a disaster that could have been avoided, which makes it especially tragic. So the Eastland was built as a cruise liner and ran into a lot of trouble as soon as she was conceived. She frequently did not make inspection, and then they would just kind of slap a Band-Aid on it. She kept changing hands. They would re-outfit her and rename her and use her for different things to try to get around the way that this boat was just really not working. So finally, in 1915, she becomes the property of the Western Electric Company, and they want to use this ship to sell pleasure cruises, picnicking people over to Michigan City and Indiana. And on this maiden voyage, they gave a bunch of free tickets to their employees and their families to encourage this, new pleasure cruise that they were offering. So most of these employees were immigrants and their families that worked for this company that were probably really excited that day to go on this adventure. And the boat was docked in the river, was going to enter Lake Michigan and make its way over to Michigan City. It finished boarding about 2,500 people at 7:10 a.m. And at 7:28, it sort of started to move back and forth, and then it just completely toppled over port side. Many people were immediately thrown into the river. Many hundreds more were trapped inside as furniture and the cabins shifted over. And many people had been gathered to watch the ship disembark. So then there was an audience to this horrific disaster. And immediately there starts to be life-saving efforts. Despite how many people they managed to get out of the river, there was a reported 844 deaths that day. So many people perished and had to be pulled out of the river that many of the warehouses and buildings downtown were actually converted into makeshift morgues. And the one little spooky story I'll include tonight is that one of these makeshift morgues became the site of Oprah's Harpo studio. And workers at the Harpo set often claimed that the site was haunted, probably from victims of the Eastland disaster. Um, so this also led to a lot of arbitration and lawsuits and trying to hold somebody accountable for this disaster. Unfortunately, due to lack of evidence, it could not be pinned on any of the owners of the ship and was ultimately dropped. Nobody was indicted for this. And it was just an incredibly tragic loss of life. And there is a monument to the Eastland disaster at the same site of the DuSable monument at the bridge. If you stop along the river, that beautiful stretch of river, and can pay tribute to the victims of the Eastland disaster. So the lake today, I'm gonna really wrap this up now, but we still, of course, have a huge maritime industry, even though a lot of it is hidden. But some of the maritime industry that people may be less aware of is that because the lakes are so cold, ships do not decompose in the lake bed. And so there's actually a huge industry of marine archaeology in the Great Lakes system. You can be trained to shipwreck dive by the Chicago Maritime Archaeology Association. And this is a kind of specialized tourist industry for the Great Lakes. So you can go and visit these wrecks. In other places on the lake system, there are wreck tours, but there are many such sites just off Chicago. And if you are coming in overhead on a plane, you can actually see some of them when the lake is clear. Um, There is, of course, current threats to the sanctity of the Great Lakes. I wanted to throw in the Friends of the Chicago Lighthouse, but also all the efforts that are currently happening to clean up the South Branch to prevent pollution to our neighbors on the south side, as well as the pushback against the data centers that are being built along the shoreline. We have to continue to protect our freshwater seas. And this is an ongoing effort. So I guess to conclude with my very general survey of Chicago maritime history, that our maritime history is what helped build Chicago. I take a lot of pride in it. I think it's really interesting that this huge segment of Chicago's history has kind of been abandoned in just the last few decades. But it's good to take pride in it. It's good to protect our fresh water. And just as a final reminder, this is our city seal. And that ship on the side, representing the commerce of Chicago, was part of the original conception of the seal when the city was incorporated in 1837. So, thank you very much.